That was fun. North to south, coast to coast, around the world, this is the Wells Report. We live life in the computer age. Have you noticed? You know what drives me crazy about living life in the computer age? I understand that computers are high-speed idiots. In other words, they do exactly what you tell them to do, except when they don't. And so what ends up happening is that they get this idea that they can update themselves. And so I have this computer that runs all the music and gives me time. It's basically my technical director. And it's fantastic. Except it decided to update itself today. And I told it not to. And it did it anyway. It just decided that it was going to update itself. And what happens when that happens is that things have these cyber collisions inside the computer, which caused me to have to reboot the dang thing. So I reboot the dang thing and it just sits there. And I'm going, yes. So much for being a high-speed idiot. Anyway, so it finally pops up here and so on. So we have a rule at the Wells Report. Never update your computer before the broadcast because stuff like this happens. This time, I didn't do it. It did it all by itself. I'm unhappy, grumpy, and mean this moment. So I'm going to try to break this strain of outrage by a small little nod back to Father's Day weekend. Father's Day weekend was fantastic for me. And I wanted to put kind of a cherry on top of a beautiful Father's Day weekend with this. It's a dad joke. What do you call an alligator wearing 1/3 of a three-piece suit? What do you call an alligator wearing 1/3 of a three-piece suit? That's right. An investigator. So, my executive producer, Dirk Steele, is currently flopping on the floor having a seizure because of that joke. So there you go. Let's talk a little bit. Oh, yeah, that's right. We no longer have a technical problem here. So let me figure this out here. Just a moment. Yes. Here we go. There. We no longer have a technical problem, except, of course, for that joke. Let's get back to work here. All right. So today is Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is something that I saw, heard about it, said, okay, Juneteenth. All right. It's another concocted holiday to essentially perpetuate systemic racism in the United States. And then I started doing some research on it, and I realized that Juneteenth is an important holiday. In fact, it probably ought to be a national holiday. Further, I have no idea why it's not a national holiday. Now, I say that's not exactly true. I know exactly why it's not a national holiday. And when I get finished with this, you will know as well. So, in case you do not know, let's do a little bit of reporting on this. President Abraham Lincoln, says USA Today, issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years before all enslaved people in Confederate territories were told they were free. Juneteenth is a combination of June and 19th. It's a federal holiday that commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. It is the longest running African American holiday. Speaking of systemic racism, it is an essential American holiday. I don't know why you have to make it an African American holiday, although they were affected the most by this, I suppose. On January 1st, 1863, known as Freedom's Eve, enslaved and free African Americans gathered in churches and private homes all across the country until the news had arrived. President Abraham Lincoln issued the declaration that all persons held as slaves in Confederate states are and henceforward shall be free. Only through the 13th Amendment did emancipation end slavery throughout the United States, but it began with the Emancipation Proclamation. Enslavers were responsible for informing enslaved people, but not everybody in Confederate-controlled territory would immediately be told. The westernmost Confederate state of Texas was the last to announce the proclamation. On June 19th, 1865, 2,000 Union troops under Major General Gordon Granger informed a community of 250,000 enslaved people in Galveston Bay, Texas, who came to know the date as Juneteenth. It is an amazing day, and it's an important day. So it's a national holiday, but why don't we use the entire holiday? Why isn't this a national weekend holiday? Why don't we do that? I don't have any idea, really. It should be. It should be an amazing day to celebrate freedom in the United States. Now, I'll point this out. The Emancipation Proclamation did nothing to stop bigotry in the United States, which is just as horrifying a crime against humanity as the other ones. By the way, we have this from Anhoy Guzman. Juneteenth has been celebrated in Texas since 1866. It is the end of all slavery in the Civil War. Fortunately, President Lincoln did not make the emancipation colorblind. He included all enslaved people. In 1980, Texas became the first state in the U.S. to declare Juneteenth a state holiday by a Republican governor. While majority of states observe the day, only a handful of states outside Texas recognize it as a paid state holiday. In 2019, President Trump tried to get Congress to acknowledge it. Democrats refused to hear it. Why? Why isn't Juneteenth a national holiday? Juneteenth is exactly what America is all about. It is about freedom. It is about liberty. It is about opportunity. Why wouldn't this be just as big a holiday as President's Day? Especially considering the President's Day honors both Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. How come? Why wouldn't the Democrats hear it? Ann says that. I'm sure she's correct. But why wouldn't Democrats hear that? There are a lot of very interesting pictures in USA Today. I'm gonna show some of them to you here. This might be a little bit messy, sort of like your typical PowerPoint or Teams meeting thing where people show you stuff. This is Abraham Lincoln. Let me see if I can make it bigger. There you go. So this is Abraham Lincoln. So on and so on. This is, oh, wow. This is a copy of the General Order. Let me see if I can move this over. I can't. All right, let me see. Yeah. General Order number 3. And that's signed by order of the Major General Granger. There you go. And these are people who are free. And then, of course, USA Today goes into Jim Crow era, civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about Juneteenth. It is not just an important holiday, it's an essential one. But how come Democrats haven't made it a national holiday where we all celebrate? More about that coming up in just a moment. This is the Wells Report. Hello. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 3 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will return in 1 minute. The Wells Report returns in 30 seconds. This is the Wells Report. Good morning. I am John David Wells. Thanks very much for being a part of our broadcast today on Juneteenth. It's June 19th. It is the day celebrated around the country, or more observed around the country, than necessarily proclaimed as a national holiday. It is a national holiday, but we don't take time off for it. Why not? Why not? Is it because it conflicts with the Father's Day holiday? But a holiday that celebrates the end of slavery in the United States ought to be a day that everybody has the day off to contemplate the amazing achievement that was. But how come that's not the case? I've long drawn a contrast between racism in the United States, which is a crime against humanity, and the exploitation of racism in the United States, which is a crime against a united country. And in this particular case, there are a couple of stories here. One proclaiming Juneteenth, great holiday, one that we should all actually stop our work to celebrate. But what we have is just a mere observance. Why? Why is that? One of our chat people said, well, because Democrats didn't want to hear it. Well, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? Let me get back to these two articles that I'm talking about here. There's Juneteenth, celebration photographs, USA Today, great article. You ought to see it. General Order number 3. It's amazing. Handwritten. It's really amazing. But then there's this, Mike Freeman, an opinion piece. The headline, it's Juneteenth. Black athletes must ask, how do we stop attacks on Black power? Black power? I haven't heard that term since 1968. This column is extremely black, he says. But Mike, what if a white man wrote a column saying this column is extremely white? Well, that would be any hour on Fox News, Mike says snarkily. This column is extremely black because it's Juneteenth, and its purpose is a simple one: to remind black athletes of the extreme anti-blackness movement that they and most black Americans face. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm missing something. Is there an extreme anti-blackness movement in the United States? Is there? And if there is an extreme anti-blackness movement in the United States, if there's an extreme anti-blackness movement in the United States, who's perpetrating it on black people in the United States? Who's doing it? Can someone please explain? Telephone number 817-379-2172. Juneteenth is where we should all come together to celebrate freedom and liberty, to celebrate all the great things of America in our founding documents. All men are created equal. You know that part. So why don't we? Well, then there's the exploitation of racism. Well, black athletes need to stand up for black power. And then throws out there the predicate that there is an extreme anti-blackness movement in the United States. If there is, who's perpetrating it on black people in the United States? Who? Because I'm confused. Now, we might have an answer to that, and we're going to talk about that next. What I want to know is this. Why is it that, I have people that, are looking at that and trying to parse things away from the Emancipation Proclamation? Why? Why don't we just say this is Juneteenth and we all should celebrate and start celebrating? More about this coming up in just a couple of seconds. This is the Wells Report. Stay where you are. Thanks very much for being a part of our broadcast. It continues on Juneteenth next, right here. Stay put. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will be back in 4 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 3 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will return in 1 minute. The Wells Report returns in 30 seconds. This is the Wells Report. Greetings. My name is John David Wells. News, analysis, commentary, and debate. That's what we do here. We report the news honestly and fairly. Today, we're talking a little bit about Juneteenth. We're talking about a celebration of the end of slavery in the United States. Why is it not a national holiday where we all get to sit down and go out to a city park someplace and have a wonderful celebration? Well, there's somebody on USA Today, a sports columnist, in fact, talking about how this is a situation where black athletes need to stand up for black power in the United States. I have differing ideas about what that standing up should look like, and we've talked about it from time to time here on the Wells Report. But that's not where we're going with this one. Where we're going with this one is how come this isn't a national holiday where everybody gets the day off? Because it crashes into the Father's Day weekend? No, that's not it. That's not it at all. We could just take today off. We should be doing that anyway. Why don't we have it? Well, I have some thoughts, which is why I'm talking to you on the opinion camera. In this particular case, the exploitation of racism has become more important than racism itself. The United States has proven itself to be a nation that reviles racism, that absolutely reviles slavery, and we've moved away from it. But why is it that we still find ourselves in a position where we are constantly being dragged through all this? Well, that's the exploitation of racism for political effect. Black power? Really? Don't you think it should be something more like American power, considering Juneteenth is about freedom and liberty and all things American? Doesn't make any sense. And in that same column, the guy says anti-black extremism. Anti-black extremism. Perpetrated by who? Let's take this one at a time. So, if this is exploitation of racism, then what we don't do is we don't celebrate the end in the United States of a crime against humanity. We don't celebrate that uplifting thing. What we do is we use it as a way to push people into either feeling put upon because of racism. That's not a small thing, by the way. I'm just saying. Or being accusatory of other people who say all white people are racists. So that's the exploitation. If you actually mark a day in the United States, Juneteenth, as a celebratory day for the end of slavery, then what happens to the slavery reparations issue? Well, it explodes in its own absurdity. That's what happens. That's why there isn't a bipartisan bill making this a national holiday, which is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And then so I said, okay, so how come we're not taking the day off going to a city park and celebrating this day with our neighbors? Why are we doing this? Well, because it's dangerous. So let's talk a little bit about this. This from the London Daily Mail, offshore news. Juneteenth holiday horror. 4 people are shot dead, at least 42 others injured so far this weekend as gun violence erupts across the nation, from Illinois to Missouri. Well, first thing, Illinois and Missouri are contiguous states, so that's not across the nation. It's across part of the nation, I guess. But let's just assume that the London Daily Mail isn't necessarily up on American geography. Let's just keep going here. But here's what they say. 20 people shot, one fatally during a Juneteenth celebration early Sunday morning in Willowbrook, Illinois. The gunfire erupted during an illegal street takeover attended by at least 300 people overnight outside the Willowbrook shopping center. At least 5 people killed, dozens injured in several other shootings across the country during the holiday weekend. 5 people killed, at least 42 injured in multiple shootings as violence erupted across the country over the holiday weekend. A shooting at a Juneteenth celebration in a suburban Illinois town left 1 person dead, 20 people shot outside a shopping center overnight. It happened at 12:30 a.m. on Route 83 near Honeysuckle Lane in Willowbrook, Illinois. Battalion Chief Joe Ostrander with the Tri-State Fire Protection District told WLS. Witnesses said the massive crowd of 300 people gathered for a Juneteenth celebration that turned violent. In an update later on Sunday morning, DuPage County Sheriff's Office said at least 20 people had been shot, 1 fatally, at least 1 person in critical condition. Others suffered graze wounds. There's video. You can go to dailymail.com and see it if you want to. I'm not playing it here. But here's the circumstance. Now we start talking about Mike Freeman's article in USA Today about anti-Black extremism. Who's perpetrating anti-Black extremism? It must be those people that President Biden is talking about. White extremists. They must have been doing the shooting. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. Because if white extremists had gone into a Juneteenth celebration and shot a bunch of people, it would be the front page story on every newspaper in the world. It's bad enough that there was shooting on Juneteenth anyway. So once again, please help me on this. Where is this Black extremism happening? This anti-Black extremism? 1 minor was killed after 10 people. Let's see. This is St. Louis. Let me get you back to this article here. Was supposed to be a Juneteenth celebration. We just started hearing shooting. We dropped down until the shooting stopped, said Makisha Avery. They just kept going. After that, we literally scattered away. Emergency services responded to the shooting outside the Willowbrook Shopping Center. After gunfire erupted, a massive police presence remained on the scene. At 5:30 a.m., investigations are underway. No arrests have been made. No further information has been released. Sheriff's Office has asked anybody with information to call 630-407-2400. The shooting in Illinois was just one of several overnight acts of violence on this holiday weekend ahead of Father's Day and Juneteenth on Monday. One minor killed after at least 10 people under the age of 18 were shot in St. Louis. St. Louis Metro Police said the shooting happened in the area of Washington Avenue and 14th Street at 1:45 a.m. Witnesses told KMOV-TV the shooting took place inside a building. One of the teens was pronounced dead at the scene. Names of the victims and conditions of those wounded in the shooting are not immediately available. This is obviously a little out of date. There is some other reporting on this. 2 people killed, 3 injured in a shooting near a Washington State campground area hosting people attending a nearby music festival. The Grant County Sheriff's Office received a report of shootings of a shooting shortly before 8:30 p.m. at a camping area near the small city of George, 149 miles east of Seattle. Officers pursued the suspect, who was then arrested and taken into custody. Names and conditions of victims not immediately available. Organizers of the Beyond Wonderland Electronic Music Festival said on social media Sunday's events at the Gorge Amphitheater were canceled. Shooting occurred in the campground adjacent to the concert stages. According to the sheriff's office, concert organizers described the location as an overflow camping area. The shooter was among 3 injured. That was according to Kyle Foreman, public information officer with the Grant County Sheriff's Office. The state trooper and a suspect were killed Saturday afternoon in a shootout in central Pennsylvania. This is what they mean about across the country. This actually did happen across the country. A state trooper and a suspect were killed in a shootout in central Pennsylvania hours after the suspect seriously wounded another trooper. Don't know whether this has anything to do with Juneteenth. Police in Juniata County said a man engaged troopers at 12:45 near the Lewiston Barracks, shot one trooper who was taken to the hospital with serious injuries. Authorities found the man shortly after 3 p.m. in Walker Township. The name of the trooper and suspect who died and the name and condition of the wounded trooper not immediately available. 8 wounded during a pool party at a California home. 8 people injured in a shooting that unfolded during a pool party at Southern California home on Saturday. Police responded to the scene in Carson, California, south of Los Angeles, shortly after midnight to find the victims ranging in ages from 16 to 24. Were these the Proud Boys? Proud Boys? Is that who did it? Oath Keepers? Who did this shooting? Well, we know it wasn't the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys, because if it was the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, like I said, it'd be on the front page of every newspaper in America. Now, I realize that there might be some people that are annoyed about this observation. I understand. I get it. And I'm not going to intensify the annoyance by playing the videos. One, we can't really determine who's doing the shooting in the video. All we can do is hear gunfire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the Chicago shooting, they can't figure out exactly who was doing the shooting, so we really don't know whether it was the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or any of those other supposed white extremist groups. But we do know that white extremism is the number one domestic violence issue in the United States, right? Well, who's doing the shooting? This is the problem. This is the issue. Now, I'm not going to opine any further. I'm not going to opine any further on this. I'm just going to leave the question hanging. If you have a response, by all means, share it. 817-379-2172. But until somebody stands up and in a loving, benevolent way, like I'm doing, for example, and tell the truth about all this, this is never going to get solved. So by all means, if white extremists are responsible for all these shootings, hang them from the highest tree as quickly as you possibly can. Good heavens to Betsy, put them in a courtroom, try them before a jury of their peers. If they are guilty of murdering somebody, take them out of society forever. That too will help solve this problem. I just want to find out who's doing the shooting. And everybody else listening to this broadcast needs to find out who's doing the shooting. And those people need to be punished by law, harshly, especially if people died. But then that takes us back to law enforcement, doesn't it? That takes us back to political law enforcement, which is not law enforcement. It's politics enforcement. And what's the long-term effect of all of this? The long-term effect of all of this is that actual law becomes less and less important. Political law becomes more and more important. And before you know it, you're throwing people that you disagree with politically in jail. There also needs to be truth-telling as to just exactly who's responsible for these attacks. Certainly on of all days, Juneteenth. Now notice, I brought up racism as a crime against humanity. I brought up exploitation of racism as a political tool that divides this nation more and more every single day. The only persons that I have talked about from a racial basis doing violence are white extremist groups. Well, which white extremist groups pulled off these shootings? So, as we wrap ourselves around this axle, let's keep in mind the reality of it. I was talking to a friend of mine about the end of the Soviet Union. The end of the Soviet Union wasn't necessarily economic or what have you. The end of the Soviet Union was when politics became more important than reality. It's happening here. It's happening here in this nation. Is that the kind of nation that we want? Telephone number 817-379-2172, 817-379-2172. By the way, if you have any kind of comment that you would like to put on the chat room, you can find that on the platform you're watching this broadcast on, even as we speak. I would prefer the telephone call at 817-379-2172. This is the Wells Report. Thanks very much for being a part of it. We'll be back with more coming up in just a couple of moments on Juneteenth. Back in a second. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Our telephone number is 817-379-2172, 817-379-2172. So let's talk a little bit about this. The Supreme Court of the United States delivered, according to Newsweek magazine, delivered good news to criminal defendants this week, allowing prison sentences to run concurrently rather than consecutively. In a unanimous decision released last Friday, the court determined that federal criminal sentencing law does not require judges to set sentences back to back, and convicts can serve concurrent sentences instead. In Laura versus the United States, Efren Laura, a man who was involved in a drug scheme in the Bronx, was initially indicted on one charge. The government brought a second indictment, then added 2 other charges. The jury found Laura guilty on all 3 counts. The district court sentenced him to 5 years in prison for the first count, which the judge said would run consecutively with a 25-year sentence on the second 2 counts. Laura appealed, arguing the 2 sentences could be served at the same time, bringing the total time down to 25 years instead of 30. In an opinion written by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, all the Supreme Court justices sided with Laura, every single one of them. So Amir Ali, executive director of the MacArthur Justice Center, applauded the ruling, pointing out that federal sentencing laws have been a major contributor to mass incarceration, hardly the case, and to disproportionate sentences that most ordinary people would find appalling. Justice Jackson's opinion makes clear that for this federal offense, courts are not forced to make sentences run consecutively. They have the discretion to impose a sentence that is proportional to the crime committed. Now, there have been people that say, well, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. They should all be sentenced to all the years for all the crimes. Well, but that doesn't live up to what we call judges. Judges make decisions along this line. And while I am extremely upset about the judicial system in the United States right now as being used as a political tool as opposed to a legal one, this is something that judges need to be able to have. This is a power that judges need to be able to impose. The ability to have sentences run concurrently as opposed to consecutively. Concurrent means that 2 crimes you have a sentence on and you're serving both crimes, you're serving time on both crimes at the same time. In this particular case, it changes a 30-year sentence to a 25-year sentence. The man's going to go away for something close to 25 years. He may be paroled in time. But you wouldn't expect judges, the Supreme Court justices, in fact, to remove sentencing power from federal judges across the land. Nor should they. That's why this is a unanimous opinion. From a legal standpoint, judges have to be able to make these determinations. So what's the hue and cry? Why are people upset? Wait a minute, these people should serve every year for every sentence. What the living heck? Well, that's because the ability to set aside charges, criminality, in fact, all of these things, well, what happens there is, doggone it, these people that have committed crimes, or at least accused of committing crimes, are now not charged with them because of politics, which besmirches this Supreme Court ruling. This is what happens when you start playing politics with law. The downstream effects, the synergistic effects of public annoyance get worse and worse and worse. We're in a situation here where we have high government officials accused of roughly the same things, if not specifically the same things. Some people are treated one way, some people are treated another way. How does this serve equal justice under the law? It doesn't. It doesn't. And so when we look at all this and we think of all these things, we get outraged because, good God in heaven, this is very simple. Equal justice under the law is not a difficult concept. But as I've said time and time again, politics poisons everything. Everything. Politics poisons everything. And in that poisoning, we now find this baleful mess of who do you sentence for what reason? Who do you prosecute for what reason? Should their politics be a consideration at any level? The answer is no. It has nothing to do with who you vote for in an election. It has to do with the severity of the law that you broke, the proof that you committed that breakage of law, and the sentencing that comes after you've been found guilty, if you are indeed guilty by a jury of your peers. So this is a sensible here, in my view, this is just my opinion. This is a sensible ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States. It truly is. And it's something that this society needs to do, because the worst thing you can do with someone is take away their freedom. And when you take away their freedom in a judicial manner, that's one thing. When you take away their freedom based on a political matter, that is the road to societal ruin. This is the Wells Report, hour number 1 of the books. Back with more in just a moment. To the Wells Report, more of which. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will be back in 4 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 3 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will return in 1 minute. The Wells Report returns in 30 seconds. North to south, coast to coast, around the world, this is the Wells Report. What do we do here? We report the news, honestly and fairly. We analyze the news for fact and bias. We point out both. We make commentary, which is not news. No, commentary is simple opinion, yours and mine. And so we debate. News analysis, commentary, and debate. This is the Wells Report. And it's not an overstatement to say this show goes around the world. As a matter of fact, we're about to go to China. And the reason we're going to China is because Secretary of State Antony Blinken has met with Chinese officials, including Chinese President Xi Jinping. They are reestablishing high profile and high valued communications. And Fox News reports it like this. Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met in Beijing, shaking hands in front of photographers. At a press conference afterwards, Blinken addressed the media without Xi, telling reporters the relationship between the two nations constitutes, quote, one of the most consequential in the world, unquote. The quote continues by saying both the United States and China have an obligation to manage this relationship responsibly, unquote. Blinken then said, I came to Beijing to strengthen high-level channels of communication to make clear to make clear our positions and intentions in areas of disagreement and to explore areas where we might work together when our interests align on shared transnational challenges. And we did all of that here in Beijing. I had an important conversation with President Xi Jinping, and I had candid, substantive, and constructive discussions with my counterparts, Director Wang Yi and State Councilor Qin Gang. I appreciate the hospitality extended by our hosts in every meeting. I stress that direct engagement and sustained communications at senior levels are the best way to responsibly manage our differences and ensure competition does not veer into conflict. And I heard the same from my Chinese counterparts. We both agree on the need to stabilize our relationship. The statement continues, we have no illusions about the challenges of managing this relationship. There are many issues which we profoundly, even vehemently disagree. We will always take the best course of action to advance the interests of the American people, but the United States has a long history of successfully managing complicated, consequential relationships through diplomacy. It's the responsibility of both countries to find a path forward, and it's in both our interests and in the interests of the world that we do so. During his meetings in China, the secretary relayed that he had robust conversation about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, North Korea's increasingly reckless actions and rhetoric regarding its nuclear program, as well as over U.S. concerns about the PRC's provocative actions in the Taiwan Straits, as well as in the South and East China Seas. In responding to a reporter's question about tensions in the Taiwan Strait, Blinken warned that any crisis over Taiwan could affect quite literally the entire world. Yep. He then said this, quote, we remain committed to our One China policy with the 3 communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances. We do not support Taiwan's independence. We made it clear that we oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We have been clear and consistent in that policy, and it's very important that we preserve the status quo ante that has maintained peace and stability across the strait for decades. At the same time, we and many others have deep concerns about some of the provocative actions that China has taken in recent years, going back to 2016. And the reason this is a concern for so many countries, not just the U.S., is that where there to be a crisis over Taiwan, that's not where, it's were there to be a crisis over Taiwan, the likelihood is that could produce economic crises that would quite effectively affect the entire world. 50% of commercial container traffic goes through the Taiwan Strait every day. 70% of semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan. If, as a result of a crisis that was taken offline, we could have dramatic consequences for virtually every country around the world. President Biden believes strongly that one of the successful aspects in our relationship with China going back 5 decades has been the responsible management of the Taiwan question. We continue to believe that that's essential. Over the last year, U.S. and China saw more than $700 billion in trade, which, according to Blinken, constituted the highest level between the two countries on record. He therefore reiterated U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's testimony before Congress last week that it would be, quote, disastrous, unquote, for the U.S. to decouple and stop all trade and investment with China. We are for de-risking and diversifying. That means that investing in our own capacities and in secure, resilient supply chains, pushing for level playing fields for our workers and our companies, is essential. Defending against harmful trade practices and protecting our critical technologies so they aren't used against us. I made clear we'll continue to take targeted actions that are necessary to protect U.S. national security. The State Department provided a readout of an exchange between Xi and Blinken before their meeting in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. The Chinese side has made our decision clear, and the two sides have agreed to follow through the common understandings President Biden and this is President Xi Jinping, reached in Bali. The two sides have also made progress and reached agreement on specific issues. This is very good. It's safe to say that interactions should always be based on mutual respect and sincerity. I hope that through this visit, Mr. Secretary, that you will make more positive contributions to stabilizing U.S.-China relations. Mr. President, thank you for receiving us today. President Biden asked me to travel to Beijing because he believes the United States and China have an obligation and responsibility to manage our relationship. The United States is committed to doing that. It's in the interest of the United States, in the interests of China, and in the interests of the world, according to Secretary of State Blinken. Over the past few days, I've had candid and constructive conversations with State Councilor Qin Gang and Director Wang Yi. We discovered a broad range of both bilateral and global issues. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the way forward with you. Thank you. Now, what does this mean? Well, a lot of things. This is very careful State Department language. True professionals work in the State Department. They have an excellent grasp of just exactly how you have to communicate with all kinds of countries around the world to further U.S. interests, not necessarily say something that is misconstrued, whether purposefully or by accident, into something that can be a major issue. And that's what this language is all about. It's very, very formal. It's very, very structured. It's very, shall we say, even though it's soft pedaled when it comes to perhaps disagreements, they say candid and serious, robust conversations and so on. You're not trying to wave, pardon the pun, a red flag in front of a bull. What you're trying to do is you're trying to communicate. China has made it very, very clear that its intentions are to subdue America's influence in the world. They, in favor of themselves. They don't have the country to do it. They don't have the economic power to do it. But that's where they're headed. Competition is good. When Blinken says, hey, competition must not devolve into conflict, that's a very important and good statement. It's true. It's true. However, there are certain things that are subtle that are also understood by both sides. That any kind of conflict between the Chinese state and Taiwan would have worldwide implications. We know what that means. We do know what that means. Now, I'm really concerned about the statement that says we do not support Taiwan's independence. Yeah, I get that. I understand why they have to say that. But once again, there comes a time when the United States has to stand for something. Freedom and liberty, freedom from totalitarian government simply must be one of those things, especially when you start considering the trade agreement we have between Taiwan and the United States. So when they start talking about these things, these are a worldwide import. They most certainly are. However, the people of Taiwan have to know that the people of the United States are very interested in freedom and liberty and freedom from totalitarian rule. Now, is that the hill that you want to start World War III on? That's open to debate. That is open to debate. But China, their record of the way they handle their populace, all you have to do is trace back to their takeover of Hong Kong to realize that Hong Kong is nothing more than a shadow of itself, because people that were doing business there, a sincere bridge of commerce between the West and the East, was severely damaged by political decision-making in Beijing. That same political decision-making would immediately ruin the very serious and robust trade agreements and understandings between Taiwan and the United States. And so, Taiwan is an essential ally in the South China Sea. The Taiwan Straits are essential to world trade. Now, Secretary Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, talks about how it would be disastrous if we decouple our trade with China. It would not be disastrous. It wouldn't be disastrous for us, Might be disastrous for China. But then what you have to look at and you have to point out is that China is trying to gather as many countries into its orbit as possible to degrade the standing of the U.S. in the world. Well, okay. As we have seen with government policy from the United States, one of the best ways to degrade a country's standing in the world is to render them poorer. China needs the United States much more than the United States needs China. And that we don't step up and say, hey, if you keep trying to screw around with us, it's going to cost you sincere money. Well, that's a mistake, in my view. Just my opinion, which is why I'm talking to this camera. Donald Trump, having to deal with a lot of different things that China was doing that were deleterious to U.S. interests, sat back and said, okay, we're going to start adding tariffs to Chinese trade. It cost them a fortune. It also, by the way, reduced a lot of the sovereign debt, somewhere around $13 trillion that we have with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed into the United States because of that decision. And China stopped being so provocative. When President Biden took over, and you can debate whether or not he decided to quell or at least soft pedal some of those decisions President Biden or President Trump made. You can say, why did he do that? Is he on the payroll, et cetera, if you wish. But the simple case of the matter is that when you're dealing with a country like China, you have to be very, very firm. You have to be very, very straightforward, and you have to be willing to play hardball when the situation calls for it. Do we have the people to do that? This is the Wells Report. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 3 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. You're listening to The Wells Report, which will return in 1 minute. The Wells Report returns in 30 seconds. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. A while back, the Kakhovka Dam was sabotaged, partially destroyed. And the thought of who actually was responsible was immediately a bone of contention between both the governments of Russia and the governments of Ukraine, each pointing at each other. There were people who said, well, the United States did it. Well, probably not. The dam was in possession of Russian military forces. You can believe all the reporting that you want regarding just exactly how effective those forces are, but I assure you that what we have here is we have a situation where Russian military forces are not going to be hornswoggled so that either Ukrainians or any other national military force would be able to occupy the dam necessary to do the damage that that dam suffered. Which means one thing. And I said it on this broadcast. I said that it was done by the Russians for that same reason. Well, now what we have is we have reporting that says, well, maybe I was right. This comes from USA Today. The death toll from the June 6th collapse of the Kakhovka Dam is up to 45 people. Tragic. 29 of them in Russian-occupied territory, 16 in areas held by Ukraine. In some of the southern Ukrainian provinces downstream from the dam, water contamination is now becoming an extremely dire problem, following the massive flooding that has devastated dozens of towns along the lower Dnieper River, and led to an ecological catastrophe, threatening crops and killing millions of fish. And the evidence increasingly points to an explosion set off by Russia as the cause. A New York Times report yesterday said the Russians knew the weak spot in the Soviet-era dam, a passageway that ran through the concrete block at its base, and most likely detonated explosives there to create the breach. I have a small issue with that. One, the bottom part of the dam is the strongest part of the dam. Second, the actual breach of the dam is something that I see is happening farther up in the dam structure. Now, please understand there are all kinds of passageways through dams at different levels. What you saw by water flow is you saw that it was not a complete breach of that dam. It would have been a far worse flood had it been a complete breach. So no, it's not at the lower levels of the dam, which probably, considering Russian construction of things like this, would contain any kind of reasonable blast that would be necessary to actually damage the dam. I mean, you'd have to, you get back to another military force bringing enough explosive in there, high explosive, to do it, and it becomes an overwhelming logistical task. First, you'd have to take over the dam completely, and then people would know who was controlling the dam at the time of the explosion, because you're not going to be able to sneak in, 20 tons of high explosives to do that dam, something along that line. No, that's not going to happen. So the New York Times article goes on to say, the evidence clearly suggests the dam was crippled by an explosion set off by the side that controls it, Russia. The Times cited engineers in reaching their conclusions, also said the American government subscribes to that theory. Also, the Associated Press wrote that based on information in drone photos, Russia had the means, motive, and opportunity to bring down the dam. What they wanted to do is slow down Ukrainian military forces, and water is an excellent way to do that. Earlier in the weekend, a group of international legal experts helping Ukraine authorities investigate the disaster said it was highly likely the Russians blew up the dam. This according to Reuters. Washington-based Institute for the Study of War also determined Russians probably were behind the explosion. Just an update in case you're watching the Ukrainian war, so that you know what's happening. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. Back with more in just a moment. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will be back in 4 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 3 minutes. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will return in 1 minute. The Wells Report returns in 30 seconds. News, analysis, commentary, and debate. This is the Wells Report. Hi, I'm John David Wells. While we're on the subject of international manipulation, let's talk about one of the most, shall we say, concerted swindles in the history of the human endeavor. What is it, you might ask? Well, it's climate. Now, I opine that this multinational urging to decide that something you cannot see, something you cannot perceive, is ruining your life, and the only way to save the entire planet from cataclysmic climate doom is to pay politicians an exorbitant amount of money. This is as plain as the nose on my face. Pretty plain. And so what we have is we have this ridiculous notion that somehow carbon dioxide is going to kill you. We have seen time and time again the incompetence of governments around the world, and yet these are the very same people that say they can control the weather. No, they can't. They can, however, use the weather as a political tool to fleece their own populations, to change their standard of living, not just how their climate in their houses are. I just finished replacing that air conditioning system. That one right up there. Cost me about 11 grand. And the reason I had to replace it was because somebody in Washington, D.C. said, the R22 coolant that you use in your air conditioning is going to destroy the planet. And therefore, we're changing it, which made the replacement of the original coolant too expensive to even consider. And so instead of, say, for example, just repairing the unit that was in place, which was possible, I had to change the whole thing. This gets back to, we won't raise taxes on the middle class. Baloney. Baloney, you won't. Because I'm not the only one that had to do these things. So it's not just the climate inside your house. It's also the food you eat. You know, bugs are mighty delicious. By golly, bugs are delicious and they're plentiful. Yeah, that's fine, but I like cows and chickens and deer and buffalo. Oh, buffalo. Why the United States has herds and herds and herds and herds and herds and herds of cows when they should have herds and herds and herds and herds and herds of buffalo, I have no idea. It's better meat. It's delicious. But we don't do that. Why? Well, I guess what? Cows are easier to herd? Seriously? We know that's not a problem because we slaughtered the buffalo down to near extinction. I mean, come on. So anyway, this political manipulation of everything based on climate is continuing. It started with something called the Paris Accords. And we go back to another Secretary of State, John the Buffoon Kerry. I used to call him John the Stupid Kerry. But I believe that the more he talks, the more buffoonish he actually is. And so, John the Buffoon Kerry decided to sign on to the Paris Accords. Well, because a guy like me has to be able to make some kind of an imprint on the world because I can't do anything else. No, he really can't do anything else. He's feckless. Anyway, that being said, he signed us aboard. President Trump immediately said, "Nah, that's ridiculous. It's a swindle. We're not playing," and withdrew us. President Biden said, "No, it's not a swindle. It's essential. The entire Earth is going to implode under its own atmosphere in less than 10 years." And so we're continuing to play with what is nothing more than an elaborate political swindle that spans the globe. All politicians saying the same things. And in order to further their agenda, what else do they have to do? Well, what they have to do is they have to convince more countries to take part. Yeah, that's right. As you're sitting there watching the population of your poor country eating bugs and dirt, what we want you to do is we want you to start fighting for saving the climate. But excuse me, Mr. Multinational Swindler, my population, as you've noted, are eating bugs and dirt. In some cases, they're eating bats and dogs, cats. They're eating a lot of things that certainly aren't buffalo, not even cows, not pigs, not chicken, nothing. They're eating bugs and dirt. How am I going to afford to play your ridiculous climate game? Here comes the news. The Paris talks are coming up. Paris talks to focus on funding poor countries to tackle climate crisis. The people that have countries that are so poor, mainly because they suck up all the money in the entire country for their own lavish lifestyles, are now going to have more money poured on them to theoretically tackle the climate crisis. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into your country and we're going to change all of the air conditioning systems in all the houses to something that's more climate friendly. Excuse me, Mr. Multinational Swindler. We've got bugs and dirt. Remember that part of the conversation? We don't have air conditioning systems. To change, we don't. We don't have them. We don't even have Milestone Electric in our country to be able to change the systems, even if you wanted us to. Oh, no, that's not what we're suggesting. What we're suggesting is that we're going to give you money to fight climate. Well, how do we do that? I mean, well, we don't need you to actually do anything. What we want you to do is show up in the United Nations and give fiery speeches about how we have to save the climate or we're all going to die. And the more and more people we get to be able to do that, the more credibility our story of politicians controlling the weather is. Well, that seems absurd. That's a ridiculous thing to do, Mr. Multinational Swindler. Well, true. But you know, all the other money that we've sent your country that ended up in your own pocket in a Swiss bank account and so on and so forth, you know, you might be able to continue doing that, which means only one thing. These people are not looking for poor countries to give money to be able to fight the climate crisis. They're giving them money so that they'll say what they want them to say. In other words, this isn't climate change. This is bribing poor nations. The story comes to us from The Guardian, offshore, London. Talks on the global financial pact that will give poor countries access to funds to help them tackle the climate crisis and develop their economies in environmentally sustainable and socially equitable ways will begin next week in Paris. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, will be joined Thursday by dozens of world leaders to discuss climate finance, green growth, the debt crisis, how to tap private sector sources of investment. In other words, how we can steal from multinational corporations to be able to spend their money instead of ours. Well, we'll spend ours too. More about that in a moment. EU leaders, including the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Ursula von der Leyen and the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, will be there, but the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has not confirmed whether or not he's going to attend. Macron believes the current systems of development finance, including overseas aid from rich countries and climate finance to help poor countries cut their greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of extreme weather, are not delivering results. In other words, we're having trouble controlling the weather. There's only one thing to do. We must spend more money. Whose money? Well, multinational corporations' money. And of course, our own taxpayers' money. Oh. Is it working? Well, no. Like we said, we haven't been successful. Therefore, we must spend more. You know, if you're scratching your head and going, this is a swindle. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And you're saying, well, fortunately, we don't have to worry about that. We live in the United States. We're already crippling our own economy to be able to come up with some flim-flammery. And we're also spending incredible amounts of money. John David spent $11,000 on a new air conditioning system because we made a political decision in Washington, for example. What we're going to do now is we're going to throw more money at a problem that really doesn't have anything to do with reality. And yes, it is going to impact you. From the pages of Fox News, President Biden will announce plans to spend an additional $600 million on efforts to address climate change today. Biden will hold an event today in Palo Alto, California, touting his administration's efforts to bolster defenses against rising sea levels and associated weather catastrophes. I'm sorry, where's President Biden's house? Is it on top of a mountain somewhere in the Appalachians? The Ozarks? The Rocky Mountains? Oh, no. No, it's in Rehoboth Beach. Well, now, wait a minute. Isn't that right there on the seaside? Well, yeah, sort of like all the houses in Martha's Vineyard. Anyway, Biden will hold the event in Palo Alto, the absolute epicenter of brilliant human beings. That's sarcasm. The funding includes $575 million to reinforce coastal infrastructure and $67 million to protect California's power grid from weather events. So in other words, this is another way to try to send more money to California, who's $32 billion in debt. Is that right? Yes. Quote, the funding will support innovative coastal resilience and adaptation solutions, such as building natural infrastructure. Building natural infrastructure. Wait a minute, do they mean man-made infrastructure? Or is now man-made infrastructure natural? Natural infrastructure is a mountain. Man-made infrastructure is piling a whole bunch of dirt in some place and calling it a mountain. There is a difference. Anyway, building natural infrastructure, planning and preparing for community-led relocation, protecting public access to coastal natural resources. What? Seashells? That protect communities and ecosystems from sea level rise, tidal flooding, hurricane, storm surge, among other severe climate impacts. You know, we got people living in the floodplain right now. Why don't we spend that money on getting them out of there? Why don't we relocate those towns? No, we can't do that. No, we're going to do this across the world, right? President Biden has maintained climate change as a top priority throughout his administration. The move comes just months after the U.S. pledged another $1 billion donation to the United Nations Green Climate Fund. Biden's climate event today comes just before a series of 2024 campaign fundraising events. The president is also scheduled in California. How convenient. Convenient. Biden will meet with tech billionaires and climate donors across the state. in his largest fundraising push since announcing his 2024 re-election campaign. President Biden opened up his climate crusade on the first day in office, signing an executive order that caused the United States to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords that former President Donald Trump withdrew our nation from. Critics blasted many of Biden's climate policies, however, arguing regulations could threaten millions of jobs and destabilize the economy. Well, those policies destabilized my economy. I just spent 11 grand. Seriously? More recently, the efforts of the administration have caused exasperation among the public after officials were found to have explored crackdowns on gas stoves. Not just gas stoves, your gas furnace. Remember I was talking about how you keep yourself warm in the winter and cool in the summer? So what we're going to do is we're going to have a piece of steel excited by electricity to heat up the steel. Then we're going to blow air across it to keep you warm, as opposed to a furnace that burns natural gas, which is methane, by the way, which is virtually pollution free. And what we're going to do is we're going to just make this an entire mess when there's not enough electricity to go around anyway. All you got to do is look to California. They can't sustain even their electric car population. There's more. It's next. This is the Wells Report. This is the Wells Report, which will return in 2 minutes. You're listening to the Wells Report, which will return in 1 minute. The Wells Report returns in 30 seconds. This is the Wells Report. My name is John David Wells. I got to say hello to Clint Knight. He's currently in his car and he's listening to the Wells Report. Clint, it's great to see you, man. How nice. How are you doing? I worked with Clint at Salem Broadcasting. He's amazing. He's an amazing dude. And he says, let's see. Hi, everyone. Driving back from South Padre Island, just past a windmill farm. A lot of them aren't turning. A few don't even have blades. It's been windy the 4 days I've been here. Well, yeah. Well, you can't have these. You can't generate electricity all the time. These fans, they need rest from now and again. I know that's true with the people that watch this show. They need rest from time to time. Speaking of natural gas, why are the refineries in South Texas that I will drive by in an hour, why are they burning off bad gas? Well, there's that. Yeah. Well, because it's not profitable. What do you mean it's not profitable? You see, natural gas exists all by itself, Clint. The gas that's part of the refining process, that could be saved instead of just burned off in these gigantic torches all over a refinery, which always seemed really weird to me. Let's see, we're going to be refining fuels into gasoline and diesel fuel, all these flammable kerosene, all these things, benzene. We're going to be doing all of that, but we're going to have big, gigantic towers with flames on top of them just in case we need them to blow the whole damn thing up. Don't ask me. Anyway, they do that because it's a different kind. Yvonne says, so JD, you're saying that your fans need a rest? Yeah. I thought the burnoff was called sour gas. Well, yeah. And those of us I'm not going there. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about, by the way, those ridiculous torches that we're talking about burning off what Yvonne calls sour gas, that puts out more nasty stuff in one day than you and everybody you know that has a natural gas oven, furnace, and oh, by the way, stovetop everywhere in Texas. This is pointedly stupid. This is absurd. However, there is a global difficulty, a global burgeoning disaster that is not a joke. And that's this one. Speaking ahead of the deadline for the Biden administration to declassify any and all information related to the origins of COVID-19, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky called gain-of-function research, quote, the biggest danger to mankind, and said the United States should not fund it at home or abroad. Paul said on Fox News Sunday Morning Futures, Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi and Alex Gutenberg in an article revealed the first people to get sick from COVID were 3 scientists working in the Wuhan lab with the bat scientist, Dr. Shi Zhengli. In fact, one of them, the one they think was the first scientist to get sick, the first person to get sick was one of the ones creating new viruses not found in nature. This is called gain-of-function research. And as we said last week when we reported the story on the Wells Report, this essentially closes the deal. What I'm going to try to pursue now, whoever revealed this, if there's documentation, it's all supposed to be declassified today, in other words. And that legislation passed unanimously. If we can get those records and actually put it out there for the public to see that the first person that got sick was a scientist in a lab, then it's a done deal. Correct. It is a done deal. Now, there may have been a woman that came in contact with a sick scientist in the wet market because the scientist leaves the lab, goes to the wet market, buys himself a nice, juicy bat to feed his family. And they kill it right there on the spot, and he takes it home. Blood oozing from the packaging, dripping on the ground. It's so delicious sounding. Anyway, the woman who sold it to him, I feel awful. Lungs. Yeah, it's a done deal. I'm not the first person who came up. Well, actually, I was one of the close. I was close to being one of the first people to come up with this. Jon Stewart of the Comedy Network. He came up with it. He said they're doing gain of function lab work in the Wuhan lab. The Wuhan lab is there. The virus came from the lab. And he was immediately excoriated by all the people that said, no. This came from a cave somewhere in China that somebody got a bat from that they were going to turn into a pot roast. And that's where all this happened. No, that's not where all this happened. The reform is, according to Rand Paul, we shouldn't be funding this research in China, but we also shouldn't be funding this kind of research in the U.S. Adding the blame for the pandemic should fall on both China and the United States. To blame equally should not go to just Chinese authorities, but to Anthony Fauci and all those who advocated for this. Bill Gates has been over there recently. Bill Gates is the largest funder of trying to find these viruses in remote caves and bring them to big cities. What happened in China is that they went 8 to 10 hours south of Wuhan, 200 to 300 feet deep into a cave, found viruses, and took them back to Wuhan, a city of 15 million. Yeah. You know, when you say follow the science, following the science can get you killed because these scientists are trying to find things that will get you killed. Thanks for joining us on the Wells Report. God bless you and yours, and we'll see you again tomorrow. And so there you go. And thank you so much. And God bless all y'all. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks very much for being a part of the broadcast. And what we'll do is we'll do this, like I said just a moment ago, we'll do this again tomorrow. Until then, have a very safe day. And as Miss Susan says, be safe.